Late November 1944. The Huitjin forest, along the German border east of Aachen, had already swallowed thousands of American soldiers whole. Fog clung to the fir trees. Snow was starting to fall through a canopy so thick that soldiers on the ground sometimes couldn't tell if it was morning or dusk. Somewhere in that darkness, a German sniper attached to a Wehrmacht infantry regiment had done exactly what he'd been trained to do: dig in, camouflage, wait, and kill one man at a time from a position no one should have been able to find. He had picked his spot with care. A depression behind a fallen log, needles piled over a shooting mat, a lane of fire angled just off the trail so muzzle flash wouldn't be visible from the direction his victims would be walking. By every rule taught in German sniper schools since 1941, that position was invisible. And yet, within hours, American scouts walked a patrol almost directly to it. This happened again and again. Across the forests of the Ardennes, across the hedgerows of Normandy, across the shattered towns of the Rhineland, German snipers who had done everything correctly kept losing their sanctuary. Captured snipers reportedly gave conflicting, almost bewildered explanations to their interrogators. Some blamed traitors. Some blamed radio intercepts. Some insisted the Americans had been tipped off by local civilians. None of them landed on the real answer, because the real answer wasn't a secret informant or a broken code. Picture the moment from the American side instead. A rifle squad advancing along a muddy trail through the Huitjin's endless stands of fir. A single crack from somewhere off to the left, and a man drops. In the movies, this is where the hero spots a glint of a scope and puts a bullet through it in one dramatic beat. In reality, nobody saw anything. The shooter fired once from deep shadow, and by the time the echo had finished rolling through the trees, he was already moving to a fallback position, exactly as his training demanded. What should have followed was confusion, a wasted hour of searching the wrong tree line, maybe a second casualty from a nervous soldier walking into the sniper's escape route. Instead, within a remarkably short window, American scouts converged on a spot the sniper had never fired from twice and had left only minutes earlier. The forest hadn't given him away. Something else had. It was a system. A quiet, unglamorous, almost bureaucratic system of observation geometry and patience that the U.S. Army had been building since the deserts of North Africa. One that turned ordinary infantrymen into instruments precise enough to read a landscape the way a detective reads a crime scene. By the end of the war, that system would help write the doctrine for every modern counter-sniper unit that followed it. But in late 1944, it was still a half-secret, half-improvised craft, and the men on the receiving end of it had no idea what had actually found them. So what was it? How did American scouts, men with no dedicated sniper rifle program to speak of, a fraction of the Soviet Union's 60,000 trained snipers, and none of the mystique later attached to Vietnam-era or modern designated marksmen, managed to consistently locate hides that should have been undetectable? That is the mystery this documentary is going to answer. Not with speculation, with the actual, documented mechanics of how the U.S. Army learned to hunt hunters. To understand why German snipers were so confident in their concealment, You have to understand how thin the American sniper program actually was going into the war. The United States entered World War II with no standing sniper school, no dedicated sniper rifle in mass production, and no institutional memory of the kind Germany or the Soviet Union carried out of the previous war. The eventual standard was the M1903A4 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle adapted from a design that was already older than most of the men issued it, fitted with a modest telescopic sight. It was accurate, but it was not revolutionary. It gave American shooters no technical edge over a well-trained German rifleman using a K98K with a Zeiss scope. Germany, by contrast, had reacted with alarm in 1940. One to the casualties its officers and NCOs were taking from Soviet marksmen on the Eastern Front, and had rushed a large-scale sniper training program into existence almost overnight. By the time American troops were fighting in Normandy in the summer of 1944, German snipers were operating from a doctrine that had already been tested and refined against one of the most sniper-saturated armies on Earth. On paper, this should have been a mismatch entirely in Germany's favor. But a rifle and a scope only solve half the problem of sniping. The other half, the half that actually determines whether a sniper lives through the engagement, is concealment. And concealment isn't really about hiding. It's about predicting what the enemy will look for and denying them exactly that. This is where the story usually being told about WWII sniping goes quiet, because most popular history fixates on the shooters, the kill counts, the duels, the legends like Vasily Zaitsev at Stalingrad, credited with roughly 40 kills in his first 10 days on the line, or the disputed story of his hunt for a supposed elite German sniper named Erwin Koenig, a tale historians still treat with real skepticism, since no wartime German record confirms Koenig existed at all. Even the propaganda machines of the era understood that a duel between two named marksmen made a better story than the truth, which is far less romantic. Most sniper casualties on both sides were the result not of legendary duels, but of one side's observation discipline being better than the other's concealment discipline. The U.S. Army, without the mythology, was quietly building exactly that kind of observation discipline. And it started not with marksmanship, but with a completely different military specialty: intelligence and reconnaissance training for infantry scouts. Infantry scouts weren't snipers. Their job was to move ahead of the main body, observe enemy positions, and report back, the eyes of the unit, not its trigger fingers. But by 1943, American training doctrine had begun deliberately fusing scout observation skills with basic marksmanship instruction, producing men who thought about terrain the way a sniper does, whether or not they ever fired the killing shot themselves. This mattered enormously, because a German sniper's greatest asset wasn't his rifle. It was the assumption that the enemy searching for him would look for a person. American scouts had begun to be trained to stop looking for a person and start looking for a pattern. There was a practical reason the U.S. Army leaned this direction, instead of trying to outproduce Germany's sniper schools. Building an elite marksman from scratch takes months of dedicated range time, Ammunition the Army was already rationing carefully for a two-ocean war, and instructors who themselves had to be pulled from the very units that needed them at the front. Teaching an existing infantry scout to read terrain more carefully, by contrast, could be layered onto training he was already receiving. It was cheaper, faster, and it scaled. A rifle company could not quickly produce 3 expert snipers. It could, with the right NCOs, produce 30 scouts who all thought a little more like hunters than they had a year earlier. That distinction, searching for a person versus searching for a pattern, is the seed of everything that follows. It sounds almost too simple to explain how professionally trained, combat-hardened German snipers kept being found. But nobody yet understood exactly how far the U.S. Army would push that idea, or how mechanical they would eventually make it. The early tests of this approach came in North Africa and Sicily in 1942 and 1943, campaigns fought across terrain that offered German and Italian riflemen plenty of natural cover, rock outcroppings, irrigation ditches, olive groves with just enough undergrowth to swallow a prone man whole. American units arriving in Tunisia in early 1943 were, by most accounts, green and improvising. Officers who had studied Army field manuals on reconnaissance found themselves adapting those lessons under fire, refining them through repetition rather than formal revision, because there was no time to send updated doctrine back through the training pipeline, while men were still dying in the Kasserine passes. By the time the fighting moved to Sicily that summer, and then to Italy itself, a rough consensus had begun to form among veteran squad leaders. The enemy sniper who survived longest was rarely the best shot. He was the one whose position was hardest to reconstruct after the fact, and the American units that suffered the fewest sniper casualties over time were not the ones with the sharpest-eyed individual soldier, but the ones whose entire squad had absorbed the habit of watching the ground, not just the tree line, for anything that looked disturbed, symmetrical, or simply wrong. The pattern-based approach American scouts were being taught had a name in later doctrine, though in 1943 and 1944, it was still closer to folk wisdom passed between veteran NCOs than a codified system. Read the ground, not the man. A sniper hide has to satisfy several competing requirements at once, and those requirements are what betray it. It needs a clear field of fire, which means some amount of vegetation or obstruction must be cleared or altered. It needs to be elevated or angled enough to see a killing zone, which limits the available terrain to a predictable subset of high ground, tree lines, window frames, and rubble piles. It needs concealment from the front, which snipers of every army were drilled to prioritize, but concealment from a searching eye looking from the side, from above, or from behind is a much harder problem, and one German training manuals of the period spent comparatively little time addressing, because Wehrmacht doctrine assumed the enemy would search primarily along the axis of the sniper's own field of fire. American scouts were taught to do the opposite. Instead of scanning the direction a bullet had apparently come from, they were taught to circle wide and examine likely hide locations from multiple angles before ever exposing themselves to the suspected line of fire. This single habit, approaching from an angle the sniper hadn't accounted for, solved a huge percentage of impossible detections that German prisoners later couldn't explain. They had built a position invisible from the front. Nobody had told them it needed to be invisible from 3 other directions as well. Then there was muzzle signature. German sniper doctrine, like every army's, emphasized shooting from the shadow of foliage rather than its edge, since a rifle fired from just inside a tree line produces a visible flash and a distinct puff of disturbed dust or snow that a shooter positioned at the tree line's edge would expose to observers immediately. Well-trained German snipers knew this and typically fired from several feet back into cover. But several feet back still has to intersect with a clear firing lane, and a clear firing lane, once again, requires some disturbance of the natural environment. A few branches trimmed, ground cover flattened by repeated prone positioning, subtle wear patterns that build up over hours of a sniper shifting his weight. American Scout training in 1943 began deliberately incorporating what would later be called sign reading, interpreting disturbed foliage, compacted snow, bent grass, or unnatural symmetry in vegetation as evidence of human presence, borrowing techniques that had circulated in American hunting and woodcraft culture for generations, and had never before been formally folded into infantry doctrine at scale. A hunter tracking a deer looks for exactly these signs. Before the war, almost none of that expertise had been captured in a military training pipeline. Now it was being taught to 18 and 19-year-old draftees standing in muddy assembly areas in England and North Africa, because someone in Army Training Command had realized that woodcraft and counter-sniper work were, at their core, the same discipline aimed at different prey. This created a genuinely new problem for the U.S. Army, though one that wouldn't be solved by observation training alone. Knowing that a hide existed somewhere in a given tree line was not the same as knowing exactly where. A patch of disturbed ground might mean a sniper. It might mean an artillery observer, a forward machine gun nest, or nothing at all, a deer bed, a foxhole dug and abandoned days earlier, wind damage from a passing storm. Scouts who charged every suspicious patch of ground were as likely to get themselves killed by a genuine sniper as they were to flush out a false alarm. There was a third layer to this sign-reading discipline that veterans of the fighting in Normandy's hedgerow country, the notorious bocage, would later describe in vivid detail. The peculiar quiet that settled over a landscape once a sniper had been in position for hours. Birds that had been calling steadily would go silent near an occupied hide, disturbed by a presence they could sense but couldn't identify. Insects that swarmed freely over undisturbed vegetation avoided ground that had been recently compacted by a man's body weight. None of this was written into any training manual as a formal checklist, but it circulated as folk knowledge among veteran scouts, passed from one replacement to the next in the way that survival lessons always spread fastest at the front, regardless of what the official doctrine said. A newly arrived private might be told, almost offhandedly, to notice when the woods went quiet, and to treat that silence as information, not atmosphere. The bocage terrain of Normandy made all of this both more necessary and more dangerous to practice. Sunken lanes bordered by earthen embankments and thick hedgerows created a maze of blind corners and short sightlines, often no more than 50 or 60 meters, in which a German sniper could set up practically on top of an advancing American column and still remain hidden until the moment he fired. Standard formations built for open ground were poorly suited to this compartmentalized terrain, and it took weeks of costly fighting through June and July of 1944 for infantry units to adapt, developing new small unit tactics for clearing hedgerow by hedgerow rather than advancing in open lines. It was in this brutal, close-range laboratory that angle-based searching and sign reading proved their worth most starkly, because in Bocage country, there was rarely room for a sniper to fire from more than one likely position per field, which meant a squad that correctly narrowed its search to which of these 4 hedgerow corners, rather than somewhere in this entire square kilometer, had a genuinely survivable chance of finding him before he fired a second time. This created a genuinely new problem for the U.S. Army, though one that wouldn't be solved by observation training alone. Knowing that a hide existed somewhere in a given tree line was not the same as knowing exactly where. A patch of disturbed ground might mean a sniper. It might mean an artillery observer, a forward machine gun nest, or nothing at all, a deer bed, a foxhole dug and abandoned days earlier, wind damage from a passing storm. Scouts who charged every suspicious patch of ground were as likely to get themselves killed by a genuine sniper as they were to flush out a false alarm. What the Army needed wasn't better eyes. It needed a way to convert scattered fragments of evidence, a muzzle flash reported by one soldier, a sound reported by another, a wound angle recorded by a medic, into a single point on a map. That capability already existed. It just hadn't been built for hunting individual snipers. It had been built to hunt artillery. Sound ranging and flash spotting were not new inventions in 1944. They dated back to the First World War, when both sides developed networks of forward observers and acoustic sensors to triangulate the position of enemy artillery batteries from the sound of their guns firing. By World War II, American field artillery intelligence units had refined this into a mature science. Multiple observation posts, each recording the precise time a flash or bang was detected, could be cross-referenced using basic trigonometry to calculate the origin point of a distant weapon with startling accuracy, sometimes to within a few dozen meters, even across kilometers of broken terrain. This technology had been designed for artillery pieces firing shells that traveled miles and produced flashes and reports large enough to register on dedicated acoustic and optical equipment operated by specialist units far behind the front line. A sniper's rifle shot was a tiny fraction of that signature. A single crack, a small flash, audible and visible only at close range, with none of the dedicated equipment anywhere near the infantry squads actually being shot at. This was the hidden problem nobody had fully solved going into Normandy. The tools existed to triangulate gunfire with mathematical precision, but they lived in an entirely different branch of the army, operated by entirely different soldiers, supporting an entirely different mission. An infantry squad pinned down by a sniper in a hedgerow had no artillery sound-ranging team standing next to them. They had confused, frightened men diving into ditches, each with a slightly different, slightly wrong impression of where the shot had come from. And this is where German confidence in their own invisibility was, in a strange way, correct, for about the first 30 seconds of any engagement. A single American soldier reporting it came from over there, while under fire was giving genuinely poor data. Sound bounces unpredictably in wooded or urban terrain, distorted by tree trunks, stone walls, and rubble, and a panicked soldier's sense of direction under gunfire is notoriously unreliable. If the German sniper simply fired once and displaced immediately, as doctrine across every army instructed, a lone reporting soldier's confusion was often enough cover to escape entirely. But American infantry didn't rely on one soldier's impression anymore. Squad and platoon leaders were increasingly trained, following lessons hammered out in North Africa and Sicily, and refined through 1943 and early 1944, to treat a sniper engagement the way an artillery unit treated incoming fire. Gather independent reports from multiple positions, compare bearing estimates, and cross-reference them against a physical map or sketch of the terrain rather than trusting any single account. The original artillery sound-ranging networks that inspired this approach were elaborate installations, requiring multiple fixed microphone stations wired together over distances of a kilometer or more. Their recordings compared on specialized plotting boards by trained technicians who could calculate a battery's position from tiny differences in the arrival time of a shell's report at each station. None of that hardware and none of those specialists existed anywhere near a forward infantry platoon exchanging fire with a hidden rifleman 50 meters away. What infantry NCOs improvised instead was a stripped-down, human version of the same underlying principle. Where the artillery branch used microphones and stopwatches, a platoon sergeant used the collective, imperfect memory of 4 or 5 frightened men, each of whom had flinched toward a slightly different direction when the shot rang out. This was, in effect, sound ranging done by hand, by infantrymen, without any of the specialized acoustic equipment the artillery branch used, a crude, improvised, foxhole-level version of a technique developed for something far larger. 3 or 4 soldiers, each estimating a rough bearing to the shot, could be combined by an alert NCO into a usable cone of probability on the map, narrowing the search area from somewhere in that entire tree line to somewhere within this 50-meter arc. It was imprecise compared to its artillery ancestor, but it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be better than the alternative, which was a single panicked man pointing vaguely into a wall of trees. Combine that narrowed search area with the sign-reading skills scouts had been developing, the ability to spot disturbed foliage, compacted ground, unnatural symmetry, and something remarkable started happening across the European theater in the second half of 1944. German snipers who had fired one shot, displaced according to doctrine, and taken every precaution their training demanded were still being found, sometimes within the hour, because the Americans hunting them weren't looking at the whole forest anymore. They were looking at a 50-meter arc inside it, with trained eyes specifically taught to read what a hidden man leaves behind. But there was still one gap in the system. All of this, the angle-based searching, the sign reading, the improvised bearing triangulation, depended on a sniper firing and revealing himself at least once. What happened when a well-disciplined German sniper simply refused to take the shot at all, waiting hours or days for a perfect target, giving the Americans nothing to triangulate? That problem would be solved not by refining the existing methods further, but by an entirely different kind of breakthrough, one that came from watching casualties instead of watching the forest. The breakthrough came from medics and battalion surgeons, not from scouts or intelligence officers, and it emerged almost accidentally out of the grim routine of treating wounded men. Every gunshot wound has an entry, and in many cases, an exit point, and the angle between them, combined with the victim's posture and position at the moment of impact, can be used to reconstruct, with real precision, the line the bullet traveled along before it struck. This is basic ballistic forensics, and it wasn't a secret discovery unique to the U.S. Army, military medicine had understood wound ballistics for decades. What changed in the European theater during 1944 was the deliberate, systematic decision to feed that information back into the tactical picture in real time, rather than treating it purely as a medical or after-action detail. Battalion aid stations and forward medics began being asked, as a matter of routine when time and casualties permitted, to note the apparent trajectory of sniper wounds, not for the medical record alone, but for the platoon leader trying to figure out where the shot had come from. A wound entering high on the left shoulder and exiting low on the right hip, for a man who had been standing upright and facing a particular direction, described a line back through space almost as precisely as a surveyor's transit. Combined with knowledge of exactly where the victim had been standing, something his own squad mates could usually pinpoint within a meter or two, this reconstructed line could be projected backward across the map, often intersecting directly with the kind of terrain feature scouts had already flagged as suspicious. A hedgerow break, a church tower, a knocked-out vehicle hulk, a woodpile. This closed the loop that sound ranging by ear alone couldn't. A sniper who fired only once, from extreme discipline and patience, and who had displaced within seconds, had still left behind a body with a wound channel pointing directly back at his former position. The bearing didn't come from confused men diving for cover. It came from the bullet's own path through a human body, a piece of physical evidence the sniper had no way to falsify or disguise, and no way to know the Americans were even reading. None of this was pleasant work, and it's worth pausing on what it actually meant in practice. A battalion aid station in the fall of 1944 was, by every surviving account, a place of exhaustion and improvisation. Canvas tents or requisitioned farmhouse cellars lit by hooded flashlights. Medics working through the night on wounded men carried back through mud and shell fire, doing triage under conditions that left little room for anything beyond stopping bleeding and stabilizing the worst cases for evacuation. Asking an overworked medic to also note a wound's likely angle of entry could easily have been dismissed as an unreasonable extra burden. That it wasn't dismissed, and that the habit spread through aid stations across multiple divisions during the second half of 1944, says something about how seriously junior officers had come to take the sniper threat by that point in the campaign. A 10-second observation, scribbled on a casualty tag or passed verbally to a runner heading back to the line, could save the next man in that same squad from becoming a casualty himself an hour later. Layered together, angle-conscious visual searching, sign-reading trained from hunting culture, improvised multi-observer sound bearings borrowed from artillery science, and wound trajectory reconstruction borrowed from battlefield medicine, the U.S. Army had assembled something no single German sniper training manual had anticipated, a method that didn't need to outguess the sniper's concealment at all. It simply worked backward from the effects of his shot to a location, using several independent lines of evidence that converged on the same point almost regardless of how well the position itself was hidden. This is why German prisoners, when questioned, so often gave contradictory or bewildered explanations for how they'd been found. They were searching for a single point of failure, a spotted movement, a careless footprint, a betrayal by a local civilian, because that was the mental model their own doctrine had prepared them to defend against. They had never been trained to imagine an enemy assembling four separate, individually weak pieces of evidence into one precise answer. Their concealment discipline was excellent against a single observer trying to spot them directly. It was far less effective against a method that didn't need to spot them at all, only to triangulate the consequences of the shot they had already fired. But even this system had its limits, and by the final winter of the war, in the frozen forests and shattered towns of the Ardennes and the Rhineland, the U.S. Army would push it one step further, into something closer to a formalized doctrine than the improvised battlefield craft it had started as. By December 1944, as the German offensive in the Ardennes collapsed into the brutal winter fighting that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the improvised techniques scouts and NCOs had been refining for over a year were beginning to harden into something closer to formal procedure, even without a single unified sniper hunting manual codifying it all in one place. Platoon and company commanders had started deliberately assigning specific soldiers, often the same men repeatedly, chosen for a demonstrated aptitude for terrain reading rather than for marksmanship scores, to act as informal counter-sniper observers whenever a unit expected to face entrenched positions. These were not designated snipers in the modern sense. They were closer to the scout-observer role American doctrine had been building toward since 1943, now applied specifically and repeatedly against the sniper threat rather than as a general reconnaissance function. This is also the period in which the U.S. Marine Corps, fighting an entirely separate but parallel war against Japanese snipers across the Pacific, formalized its own scout sniper platoons in 1944. 2- and 3-man teams built explicitly around combining reconnaissance and precision fire, a structural echo of exactly the lesson the Army had been learning independently in Europe. that finding a hidden shooter and killing him were two different skill sets, and an effective unit needed both working together rather than expecting one rifleman to do both jobs alone. The consequence of all this, across both theaters, was a shift in the entire psychological balance of sniper warfare. German snipers in Europe had trained under a doctrine built primarily around the Eastern Front, where, despite the Soviet Union's 60,000 trained snipers, front lines were often static enough for a well-hidden position to be used for extended periods, and displacement discipline mattered more than post-shot evasion. In the more mobile, hedgerow and forest fighting of Western Europe, and against an enemy that had quietly built a multi-source triangulation habit into ordinary infantry behavior, that same doctrine left German snipers dangerously overconfident in a single layer of protection concealment, while the Americans hunting them had learned to treat concealment as only the first obstacle, not the whole problem. There is also a broader comparison worth drawing here, because it clarifies why the American approach worked as well as it did against a numerically smaller sniper corps than Germany's Eastern Front adversary. The Soviet Union entered the war with something in the neighborhood of 60,000 trained snipers, including thousands of women, an institutional scale neither the United States nor Britain came close to matching. Germany's own sniper program rushed into being in 1941, specifically in response to the casualties German officers and NCOs were suffering from Soviet marksmen, was built to counter volume, to survive an environment saturated with enemy shooters. It was not, by comparison, built with the same urgency to counter an enemy whose primary strength lay not in the number of snipers it fielded, but in the number of ordinary soldiers trained to find them. The American answer to a smaller, technologically unremarkable sniper corps was never to outproduce Germany's specialist training pipeline. It was to distribute a version of sniper hunting competence across entire rifle companies, so that a threat requiring specialized expertise to create could be neutralized by soldiers who had received only a fraction of that specialized training themselves. The stakes of this gap were not abstract. In the Huichin forest fighting of autumn 1944, the U.S. Army suffered some of the heaviest casualties of any single campaign in the European theater, with several divisions rotated through the fighting sustaining losses that in places approached a third of their committed strength, much of it from exactly the kind of small arms and sniper fire that thrives in close, forested terrain where artillery and air support struggle to help. Every hidden rifleman located and eliminated before he could account for more than one or two casualties represented a direct, measurable reduction in that toll. This was not a game of individual glory, the way post-war mythology sometimes frames sniper duels. It was closer to a numbers problem, quietly solved by making the search for a hidden man mathematical rather than instinctive. And this is the final piece of the puzzle that connects directly back to the confusion German prisoners expressed under interrogation. They assumed, reasonably, that finding an expertly concealed sniper required either luck or a specific, identifiable mistake on their part. A branch left broken, a boot print in the mud, a careless second shot. What they didn't grasp, because their own doctrine never asked them to think this way, was that the Americans searching for them weren't looking for a mistake at all. They were assembling independent fragments of evidence, an angle here, a bearing there, a wound channel somewhere else, that converged on a location almost regardless of how disciplined the sniper's individual tradecraft had been. A German sniper could execute every single rule in his training manual perfectly and still be found, because the system hunting him had never depended on him making an error in the first place. It depended on the unavoidable physical facts that any successful shot leaves behind: a sound, a flash, and a wound with a direction of its own. That is the mystery solved. Now the story returns to where it began, to a fallen log, a shooting mat of piled needles, and a position built to be invisible from exactly one direction. The German sniper in the Huitjin forest that November had done nothing wrong by the standards he'd been trained under. His hide was correctly angled away from the trail. His firing lane was narrow and shadowed. He had, in all likelihood, displaced within seconds of his shot, exactly as doctrine demanded. He had built a position invisible to a man standing where his victim had stood. He had not built a position invisible to a scout circling in from the flank, because concealment discipline of that era rarely accounted for observers approaching from an unexpected angle. He had not built a position invisible to a squad leader, plotting three confused but independently useful bearing estimates onto a map. And he had certainly not built a position invisible to a medic, kneeling over a wounded soldier, tracing a line from an entry wound to an exit wound, and handing that line, without ever seeing the sniper himself, directly back to the men now hunting him. None of the individual techniques that found him were secret or sophisticated by the standards of later warfare. Angle-conscious searching, sign reading borrowed from hunting culture, hand-triangulated sound bearings, wound trajectory reconstruction. Each one alone was a modest, almost obvious idea. What made the American system so effective and so bewildering to the men it was used against was that nobody had bothered to combine all four into a single, repeatable method before, and apply it consistently at the level of ordinary infantry squads rather than specialized units far behind the line. The German sniper couldn't explain how he was found because there was no single answer to give. There was no informant, no broken code, no careless mistake. There was only a quiet, unglamorous habit the U.S. Army had built over more than a year of hard lessons across North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the hedgerows beyond. The habit of treating a hidden man not as a mystery to be solved by instinct, but as a problem to be solved by evidence, patiently assembled from every direction he hadn't thought to guard. That habit outlived the war. It became the seed of the counter-sniper and hunter-killer doctrine that modern militaries still teach, refined over decades but built on the same basic insight born in those cold, dripping forests. You don't have to see the sniper to find him. You only have to read what his shot left behind.